Okay, hello everyone to today's meeting. Happy spring break for most of you.
Woo!
Except for
Finally.
the losers of Friday classes. But anyways, um, today we're going to be looking at some UI UX design. I'm no, I'm by no means an expert on this topic, but I just did some research on some principles or best practices that we should follow when designing UI UX in game. So let's take a look. So what is UI UX? So UI stands for user interface, and it's pretty much the visual elements that the user interacts with. And user experience stands for UX stands for user experience, and it basically maps out where to store information and how it's accessed by the user. So typically the UI UX go together, and a lot of people do both UI and UX. But first, the UX designer map out the placement of UI without like the aesthetics or anything. And then after mapping it out, then the UI designers add the visuals on top. So, yep. So UI, UX, and visual design. So to make good UI UX, you need to follow some visual design principles. And these principles are pretty much supposed to make it so that you're designing UI that is simple and intuitive for the audience to act upon. And basically, it is the most important part about UI UX is to understand the audience and how they think. You need to consider factors like how are they going to be playing with the game or interacting with whatever computer or a console. What information would they be looking for if they're looking for certain elements in the menu, and what type of game are they playing? So some visual design principles include scale, visual hierarchy, balance, contrast, and Gestalt principle. I think it's Gestalt, but let's go over them real quickly. So scale, it's pretty much self-explanatory. So if you want to attract attention to some UI elements, you need to scale it up and make it big. And so you want to decide which elements are the most important and scale it up as big as you want it. They say it's generally a good practice to only have 3 different sizes for scaling. And because you have only 3, you need to really decide and understand the importance of each UI element. So if you look at the picture over here, you can see that there's 3 different scalings. The first one is, are you sure that you want to quit? Obviously, that's the most important message that people should pay attention to, and it will draw the attention to that text for the player. And after drawing the attention, they can read any unsaved changes will be lost, and they'll be able to select yes or no. So that's an example of scaling. Also, there's visual hierarchy. So what the visual hierarchy is supposed to do is to guide the eye, basically. So visual stands for guiding the eye, and hierarchy means it needs to guide the eye in the order of importance. So visual hierarchy could be implemented with scaling, value, color, spacing, placement, and many other things. But mostly it's in scaling and color and placement. So you want to, in order to achieve visual hierarchy, you might want to use 2 to 3 different typefaces, and typefaces are like fonts, like bolded fonts or non-bolded. If you see the MoMA here, you can see kind of 3 different sizes of fonts. And you also want to have different scales for each element, like we said before. And when you're using color to establish visual hierarchy, you want to be careful about certain things. You want to use color saturation and make them stand out, and the less saturated colors will be less important, basically. But you also want to be careful not to overuse colors like red, because red is very important for warnings. Like for a game, I guess red could be something like you're losing health, you're about to die. But also for something like an app, red would be like a trash can or delete. You also don't want to use too many colors. It might be tempting to do so, but it could be really overwhelming, and my slide is kind of like an example of it. What not to do. It's not very pretty, honestly. But if there's too many colors, then people will start getting confused, and there are too many levels in the hierarchy, and it just draws attention away from the element. It is recommended that you only use 2 primary colors and 2 secondary colors, and with not too much contrast between them. And you also don't really want to rely on color completely to establish visual hierarchy, because some people are colorblind, so that's something to keep in mind. You could also use grouping to establish visual hierarchy, and it's basically, you've probably seen it all over the place in a lot of websites and apps. You can see Spotify here has certain elements grouped, like playlists, recently played, and recommended. And in order to use grouping effectively, you want to make sure that it's not too cluttered and that it needs to breathe, and there needs to be some white space between the groups in order to actually make it differentiable. So one thing you can do to make sure you let it breathe is to use the squint test. And this test is basically kind of making your eyes out of focus, like purposely squinting your eyes and making it out of focus. And you should be able to kind of like see each grouping and identify that, oh, this is a group, this is a group, this is a group, with even with the blurred image, and see what stands out and what doesn't. And obviously, the elements with the higher hierarchy, or the groups with the higher hierarchy, you want it to stand out the most. Another thing you want to consider is balance. So balance is pretty much like a satisfying arrangement or proportion of design elements. And what you want to achieve with balance is that you don't want to draw too much attention to like only one area of the screen. You want there to be even balance in attention. So balance doesn't really mean that everything has to be symmetrical. It can be asymmetrical. So people say that in order to do balance, you want to pick like a line across the screen, vertical or horizontal, and make sure that there's an even amount of elements in each side. If you make your line a little bit offset from the center, it will be asymmetric balance, and they say it makes the UI a little more dynamic and engaging. Symmetry would just be quiet and static. There's also radial balance, where you try to lead the eye to the center of the screen. Another thing to consider when you're trying to balance your UI is the golden ratio. Some UI and UI UX designers say this doesn't really matter, but some really like to use it. So the golden ratio is basically like this ratio that people say it's pleasing to the human eye, and it also draws attention to certain places. You may have seen this spirally thing all over the place, maybe on a math textbook. But an example that I see often in balance in the golden ratio within UI is this golden rectangle, where it's the center is like a little bit off center, and there's like main content area and sidebar. And it's something good to consider if you want to design some UI and make it a little balanced, and maybe try to draw attention to certain aspects. So I'm not completely sure if they used the golden ratio in here, but you can kind of see how they balanced out the UI. If the line is in like the, you can't see my cursor, but if the line is right at the border where there's a map and there's you can kind of see the center of the screen, or where they drew the line within the UI. You can count the elements, each buttons, and you can see that there's an even amount of buttons on each side. There's also the Gestalt principle. So it is basically
Have your attention. Lab will close to the public in 15 minutes. After 8 p.m., the lab will only be available to attend to parts with current power parts until 12 Once again, everyone close to the public in 15 minutes.
Okay. So the Gestalt principle is pretty much saying that humans try to simplify and organize complex images into parts. Kind of when you look at the sky and when you... Sorry, I hear someone. Who is it? Oh, it's Julius. But when you look in the sky and you see clouds and you see shapes, that's pretty much the Gestalt principle in action, because humans like to kind of connect the dots and automatically form images. You can see on the image on the right with the triangle, it's not really a triangle, it's more like three Pac-Mans facing each other, but it just kind of creates the illusion that it is a triangle. And this principle is used a lot in UI. One example is when, let me just go to Discord over here. Right over here, Shabazz. Even though there's like no boxes surrounding this little area, we know that this is all one element, or it's a message from Shabazz, because they're close to each other, and our brains kind of just connect the dots that they're supposed to be from one person. So we can kind of utilize this principle and utilize this knowledge about the human brain to influence the user and create UI that kind of changes behavior, I suppose. So those are all the visual design principles. There are also other interesting things that I found, and it's that each person usually have a viewing pattern, and most people have a pretty similar viewing pattern. There's the two most common patterns that people use, and it's Z and F, and it should show over here. Yeah, it's better to explain it in images than in words, but you can see that this UI by Apple was designed with the Z pattern in mind, so people can quickly scan the page and figure out what's going on. So this is the F pattern. And I see this a lot in a lot of news websites. And you can also see the F pattern in Animal Crossing over here. So you can see the little top bar, and people will probably scroll down and maybe look a little right. So keeping the viewing pattern in mind will help you with where you're placing UI elements and mapping out mapping out where the user will look and where you want to put the most important elements. Okay, so here's like a quick summary. Why is it stuck? Oh, okay. Hello. Okay. So here I made like a short guide to making UI from an article I read. And the first tip is that if you're making a certain genre of game, you want to use patterns that other developers have used. So for example, if you're making a shooter, you want to put the health bar on the bottom left of the screen horizontally, because if you follow these principles, it will make the life of the user a lot easier, because the audience will probably be a little familiar with this type of game and understand what the UI is communicating with really little effort. And it'll keep them engaged and save some brain power for them. Another tip is to use wireframing. So wireframing is when you only use grayscale diagrams of where you're placing the UI. So you're pretty much mapping out the UX portion. So before you add any aesthetics or colors or anything extra, animation like that, you want to make sure where you figure out where you're going to place things, and then actually inject the aesthetics and the flavor of the UI on top of it. Another big tip is to anticipate how the player will interact with the UI. even though like many UI elements, you might think it's really useful, but sometimes you can kind of predict what the player might want. So this is a Pokemon Masters EX. I've never played this game, but this is like a mobile game, I suppose. But they basically simplify the UI so much in the beginning, such that the player won't get overwhelmed. And when they're not overwhelmed, they'll be more motivated to play. And as they get more skilled at the game, they can learn more features. So they basically anticipated that a new player wouldn't want to be bombarded with so much UI that they get overwhelmed, so they simplified it for them. So another tip is to use animation in your UI. I think it sounds a little extra, but at the same time, when a game screen is just static, it could seem like the game has almost crashed or that the game isn't responding. So a lot of games like to do this thing where there's like a subtle pulse or like a flickering in the back or some moving elements, such that it just makes the game a little more engaging, aesthetic, and also make sure that the player knows the game isn't crashing. But at the same time, when you're adding animations, you need to make it simple so that it doesn't overshadow the UI. Another tip is to kind of consider the aesthetics of the UI and make sure that it connects with the game a lot. I mean, a lot of us likes to use Unity assets or just the default UI that comes with Unity. But at the same time, adding these kind of flair to the UI kind of makes the game. Like, for example, Persona 5 is really famous for their UI, and it kind of adds to the aesthetic of the game and the experience of the game. So it could actually be UI is kind of neglected for a lot of us, but it can actually make our game better, a lot better. You also, when you're designing UI, you also want to consider what type of game you have. So if your game is cinematic or immersive, you kind of don't want to break the player's immersion by just pulling up a menu screen. So a lot of games like to do this thing called diegetic UI, where the UI is kind of within the game world. So you can see over here, I don't really remember what the game on the left was, but you can see that the character itself is looking at like a hologram inside the game, and the one on the right is Fallout, and the player can use like a scroll wheel to make the character in the game scroll through the UI. And finally, another example of thinking about the game's aesthetic and incorporating it is in Nier Automata, my favorite game. So there's like an article over here where the UI UX designer was talking about kind of balancing the simplistic aspects of the UI while making it not too plain and incorporating a little bit of fantasy. So he incorporated some musical elements to the UI, and it made it look really graceful and simple, but at the same time not too flat and flavorless. And there's like an article that I enjoyed reading. And yeah, that's basically it. That's all I have to say. Here are some resources that I used to make this presentation. There's also one interesting one that I found, and it's this website where you can kind of find the UIs of many games. You can see Short Hike, Angry Birds. So if you want to design UI and you want to reference some other games, you can go to this website and do that. And I'm lost. Okay, so that was it for my presentation, actually. Very short, but I'll give you guys the attendance real quickly. And as for next week, there's no meeting next week. However, I think Julius might be planning on having like a game night on Thursday or Friday. Julius, do you have anything to say about that? Julius? Oh, I muted him. Oh. Okay, you are free.
Feels bad, man. Feels bad, man. Anyway, yeah, we're planning on having a Friday game night. For those of you who remember, we used to do Friday game nights last year. Fortunately, I couldn't keep up with them, so we had to stop for a while. But we're gonna be bringing it back next week. So we're gonna figure out what game we're gonna play. Probably put it up to you guys. I'll leave a poll in streaming later, so you can vote on whatever game we want to play. We're just gonna play it for Friday game night, and yeah, that's about it. Friday, 6 to 8.
Alright. So
Follow us on Twitch.
Okay. So that's pretty much it for today. Happy spring break.
Happy spring break, everybody.
Feedback on UIs. Oh, I mean, sure.
All right. Should I end the stream?
Yeah, you can end the stream.
Kind of get